The algorithm's flaw. Lieutenant Nova Reed stood at the observation deck of the Galactic Defense Academy, watching the gleaming ships of 17 advanced civilizations dance through their perfectly choreographed combat drills. The massive crystalline windows reflected her dark complexion and close-cropped hair, features that marked her as distinctly human among the varied species that called the Academy home. Remarkable efficiency, isn't it? The voice came from Admiral Ixil, his translucent exoskeleton catching the light of distant stars. The crystalline's faceted eyes regarded Nova with what she had learned to interpret as mild amusement. Each movement calculated to 9 decimal places of precision. Nova nodded politely, keeping her face neutral even as her mind raced through the dozens of historical battles where precision had fallen to chaos. The synchronization is impressive, Admiral. Your species will understand such things eventually, Ixil continued, his crystalline form humming with barely contained superiority. Though perhaps not for another few centuries. We've observed that developmental progression tends to be rather linear. The comment stung, but Nova had grown used to such dismissals during her 6 months at the Academy. She was the first human to be accepted into the Advanced Tactical Division, a fact that seemed to amuse her alien colleagues to no end. Their combat systems were perfect, they claimed. Optimized beyond improvement by millennia of combined intellectual advancement. Later that evening, Nova sat in her quarters, surrounded by holographic displays showing battle simulations. Her roommate, a gaseous entity named VYX, swirled nearby in patterns that indicated curiosity. You appear to be introducing errors into the combat protocols, VYX observed, their ethereal form condensing slightly in confusion. Not errors, Nova replied, fingers dancing across the holographic interface. Variables. Human variables. She pulled up footage from Earth's historical archives, battles that had shaped human military doctrine. See this? Battle of Agincourt. The English were outnumbered 5-1, fighting in terrible conditions. Every tactical algorithm would have predicted their defeat. And yet they achieved victory, VYX noted, their gaseous form rippling with interest. Through what the Academy would consider tactical errors. Nova smiled. Exactly. The alien combat systems are beautiful, perfect even, but they're built on assumptions. They assume every commander will make the logical choice, that every unit will follow optimal protocols. She gestured to another simulation. They've never had to account for a force that would march through a swamp to outflank an enemy, or fight on despite being surrounded, or charge directly into superior numbers because retreat wasn't an option. She had spent weeks analyzing the Academy's combat protocols, finding gaps that would be obvious to any student of human military history. The algorithms had never faced a Hannibal, never encountered a Napoleon, never had to deal with commanders who viewed the impossible as a challenge rather than a limitation. The quarterly combat trials are approaching, VYX observed, their form shifting to a deeper shade of blue. You intend to demonstrate these imperfections? I intend to show them why humans study battles fought thousands of years ago, Nova replied, pulling up another simulation. Sometimes the best way to break a perfect system is to do exactly what it considers impossible. The next morning, Nova submitted her application for the combat trials. The Academy's AI processed it with its usual efficiency, though she could have sworn there was a note of confusion in its response. She had spent months preparing for this moment, translating human military doctrine into the pristine language of alien combat algorithms. As she walked to her first class, Nova could hear the whispers and clicks of her alien classmates. They found her presence amusing, a primitive curiosity allowed to study among them out of some misplaced sense of inclusivity. She let them talk. Soon they would learn that humanity's primitive military education included something their perfect systems had never considered, the art of making the impossible possible. The human lieutenant smiled as she took her seat, already anticipating the chaos she was about to introduce into their orderly universe. Sometimes the best way to advance wasn't through perfect evolution, but through what the aliens would consider devolution, a willingness to embrace the unpredictable, the irrational, the human. Breaking perfect. The combat simulation chamber hummed with energy as Nova stood before the review board, her dark eyes fixed on the holographic display above. Admiral Ixil and 4 other senior instructors watched from their crystalline platforms, their various anatomies arranged in poses that suggested skepticism. Lieutenant Reed, Admiral Ixil's voice resonated through the chamber, your proposed modifications to our combat protocols are unusual. His crystalline structure flickered with what might have been concern. You suggest introducing deliberate inefficiencies into perfect systems. Nova took a deep breath. Not inefficiencies, Admiral. Adaptability. She gestured to the simulation controls, and the holographic display burst into life. Standard combat protocols assume perfect conditions and logical responses. But combat is rarely perfect, and enemies aren't always logical. The simulation showed a standard fleet formation, beautiful in its geometric precision. With a few commands, Nova introduced her modifications. The perfect formations began to shift, breaking into seemingly chaotic patterns that made several board members emit distress pheromones. What you're seeing is based on the Battle of Trafalgar, Nova explained, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. Admiral Nelson broke with conventional tactics, splitting his fleet and attacking the enemy line perpendicularly. Every tactical manual said it was suicide. Because it is, interrupted Professor Zenith, their metallic tentacles writhing in agitation. You're deliberately exposing your forces to concentrated fire. The algorithms are quite clear. The algorithms assume the enemy will maintain formation and respond optimally, Nova countered. But what if they don't? What if confusion and chaos are your allies? She advanced the simulation. The seemingly scattered forces suddenly converged from multiple angles, catching the enemy in a web of crossfire they couldn't counter because they were too busy following optimal response protocols. Impossible, whispered one of the board members, their bioluminescent spots pulsing rapidly. The combat efficiency ratings are based on assumptions, Nova finished. Assumptions that humans learned to break centuries ago. She pulled up another simulation. This is based on the tactics of Genghis Khan. His forces would deliberately appear weak and disorganized, encouraging the enemy to attack, only to reveal their true strength when it was too late. The room fell silent as they watched her modified algorithms tear apart formation after formation, using methods that violated every principle of their perfect combat doctrine. Ships retreated only to swing back in impossible arcs, units that should have been destroyed fought on with reduced capacity, and carefully calculated firing solutions were disrupted by unorthodox maneuvers. This is not warfare, Admiral Ixil declared, his crystalline form dimming in disapproval. This is chaos. With respect, Admiral, Nova stood her ground, chaos is part of warfare. The greatest human commanders didn't win by having perfect systems. They won by adapting when their systems failed, by thinking creatively when logic said victory was impossible. She brought up her final simulation. I've modified the combat protocols to incorporate these lessons. Instead of assuming perfect conditions and responses, they now account for the unexpected. They can handle broken formations, improvised tactics, and what you might call primitive solutions. The board members conferred in a cacophony of clicks, hums, and pheromone exchanges. Nova waited, her heart pounding but her exterior calm. She knew what they were seeing challenged millennia of military doctrine, but she also knew she was right. Finally, Admiral Ixil spoke. Your modifications will be reviewed further, Lieutenant. But I must ask, why do humans study such ancient battles? Surely your species has developed beyond such primitive methods? Nova smiled. We study them precisely because they were primitive, Admiral. When you don't have superior technology or perfect systems, you learn to use whatever advantages you have. Sometimes the most primitive solution is the one your enemy never sees coming. As she left the chamber, Nova's datapad buzzed with a message from VYX. The Academy AI is having what humans might call a nervous breakdown, trying to process your simulations. I believe you've succeeded in breaking perfect. Nova grinned as she headed back to her quarters. The board would need time to process what they'd seen, to reconcile their perfect algorithms with the messy reality of human combat doctrine. But she had planted the seed. Soon they would understand that true combat mastery wasn't about achieving perfection, it was about being prepared for when perfection failed. Her next class was Advanced Fleet Tactics, where she knew the whispers and stares would be more intense than ever. Let them whisper, she thought. Humanity had learned its greatest lessons from being underestimated, and she was about to teach the galaxy's most advanced species a lesson in humble beginnings. Chaos Theory. The Academy's central computing hub was in crisis. Nova stood beside Chief Engineer Rylix, whose crystalline appendages flickered with distress as they watched the main tactical computer attempt to process her combat modifications. Fascinating, Rylix muttered, their crystalline structure vibrating at a frequency that suggested both alarm and intrigue. The system keeps trying to optimize your chaotic variables into standard patterns, but each attempt only creates more variations. It's like watching a cascade failure in slow motion. Nova watched the holographic display's pulse with algorithmic confusion. It's not failing, she explained, pointing to a particular pattern. It's learning. Each variation represents a possible response to unexpected conditions. The kind of conditions that real combat creates. The news of Nova's combat protocol modifications had spread through the Academy like a quantum wave, creating equal parts dismissal and fascination. Some instructors had banned discussion of her theories entirely, claiming they would corrupt young minds with primitive thinking. Others, particularly those with actual combat experience, had begun asking questions. Lieutenant Reed. The voice belonged to Instructor Harold, a towering being of pure energy contained within a sophisticated environmental suit. A moment of your time? Nova nodded to Rylix and followed Harold into a nearby study chamber. The instructor's energy form pulsed with unusual patterns, uncertainty, perhaps? I've been reviewing your work, Harold began, their voice modulated through the suit's speakers. Your analysis of the Battle of Thermopylae is particularly disturbing. Because the smaller force should have retreated? Nova asked, already knowing the answer. Because they didn't. Harold's energy form flared. Every combat algorithm we have confirms that a force facing those odds should withdraw and preserve combat effectiveness. Yet these humans not only stood their ground but managed to inflict disproportionate casualties. It defies tactical logic. Nova pulled up the relevant simulation on her datapad. They used terrain to neutralize the enemy's numerical advantage. More importantly, they understood something our algorithms don't factor in: sometimes a tactical defeat can lead to a strategic victory. But the cost was calculated differently, Nova finished. Human military history is full of commanders who understood that victory isn't always about preserving maximum combat effectiveness. Sometimes it's about inspiring others, or buying time, or simply proving that resistance is possible. Harold's energy form swirled in contemplation. You're suggesting our algorithms are too focused? I'm suggesting they're too perfect, Nova replied. They assume every commander will make the logical choice, every soldier will follow optimal protocols, and every battle will proceed according to calculated probabilities. But humans learned long ago that the best way to break a perfect system is to do something imperfect. Later that day, Nova found herself surrounded by a group of junior cadets in the tactics lab. Word had spread about her primitive warfare seminars, unofficial study sessions where she explained human military history to curious aliens. But how did they know it would work? Asked a young Meridian, their tentacles twisted in confusion. These humans had no quantum probability calculators, no neural enhancement nets, not even basic predictive algorithms. They didn't know, Nova explained, showing them a simulation of ancient cavalry tactics. They had to trust their intuition, their experience, and sometimes just their gut feelings. When you can't calculate every variable, you learn to adapt. Adapt? The word rippled through the group like a shock wave. It means changing your tactics based on circumstances, Nova clarified. Like how Alexander the Great modified his phalanx formations based on terrain, or how Subutai used weather conditions to his advantage. They couldn't control these variables, so they learned to use them. The Academy's AI pinged her datapad, more system conflicts as it tried to integrate her modifications. Nova smiled, remembering something her old tactics instructor on Earth had said: the perfect plan rarely survives first contact with the enemy. She was about to explain this concept to her eager audience when Admiral Ixil's crystalline form appeared in the doorway, his faceted eyes scanning the gathered cadets. Lieutenant Reed, his voice carried that familiar tone of carefully measured superiority, the Advanced Combat Systems Committee requests your presence. It seems your modifications have created quite a stir among our member species. Nova felt her heart rate increase but kept her expression neutral. This was it: either her ideas would be dismissed as primitive nonsense, or she would change how the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy thought about warfare. As she followed the Admiral, she couldn't help but smile. After all, humanity's greatest military achievements had often come from being underestimated. Sometimes, being seen as primitive was the perfect tactical advantage. Primitive genius. The Advanced Combat Systems Committee chamber was a marvel of alien architecture, its walls rippling with quantum calculations and combat simulations. Nova stood at the center of the vast space, surrounded by representatives from 17 advanced civilizations. Their varied forms, crystalline, energy, gaseous, and more exotic states of matter, all focused intently on the holographic display before them. Lieutenant Reed, began High Commander Zealith, their plasma form contained within an ornate environmental suit, your modifications to our combat protocols have caused considerable disruption. The commander's energy field fluctuated in what Nova had learned to recognize as diplomatic uncertainty. Some would say unprecedented disruption. Nova straightened her shoulders. With respect, Commander, disruption was precisely the point. A murmur rippled through the assembled aliens. Admiral Ixil's crystalline form dimmed slightly in what might have been embarrassment at her directness. Explain, Zealith commanded. Nova gestured to the holographic display, bringing up her latest simulation. Our standard combat protocols are built on the assumption of perfect rationality. Every move is calculated, every response optimized. But this creates a fundamental weakness: predictability. She input a series of commands, and the simulation sprang to life. A standard fleet engagement played out, every move following the accepted tactical doctrine. Then she introduced her modifications. Watch what happens when just one commander decides to act irrationally. The perfect formation suddenly broke apart, ships moving in ways that made several committee members emit distress signals. Instead of following optimal attack vectors, the ships executed maneuvers that seemed random, even suicidal. The opposing force, following standard protocols, found their perfect formations becoming a liability. This is based on the tactics of Admiral Yi Sun-sin, Nova explained. Outnumbered and outgunned, he used unconventional tactics and local terrain knowledge to defeat a superior force. Our current algorithms would have declared his actions impossible, yet he succeeded. Because his opponents couldn't predict his movements, murmured a quantum intelligence representative, their probability matrix showing signs of actual surprise. Exactly, Nova confirmed. By breaking with conventional tactics, he turned the enemy's expectations against them. This is something humans learned through millennia of warfare: sometimes the best strategy is to be unpredictable. The chamber erupted in overlapping discussions, some arguing that introducing such chaos into perfect systems was dangerous, others noting that Nova simulations had achieved victory rates that shouldn't have been possible. High Commander Zelith raised an appendage for silence. "Lieutenant, your theories are intriguing. But they remain untested in actual combat conditions." Nova felt her heart rate increase. This was the moment she'd been waiting for. "Then test them, Commander. Run a full combat simulation, your best tactical AI against a system using my modifications." The chamber fell silent. Such a direct challenge was unprecedented. "You would pit your primitive tactics against our most advanced combat AI?" Admiral Ixel's voice carried a note of genuine curiosity beneath the usual condescension. "Yes," Nova replied simply. "Because being primitive isn't always a disadvantage. Sometimes it means being willing to try solutions that more advanced minds would dismiss as impossible." The committee conferred in a cacophony of alien communications. Finally, Zelith spoke. "Very well, Lieutenant. We will arrange a full tactical simulation. Your modified protocols against our standard combat AI. The results should prove educational." As the committee members filed out, Nova's datapad buzzed with a message from VYX. "The humans have a saying about being careful what you wish for. Are you certain about this?" Nova smiled as she typed her response, another human saying, "Sometimes you have to roll the dice." The next week was a blur of preparation. Nova worked tirelessly, refining her modifications and running countless simulations. She incorporated everything she had learned about human military history, the unexpected flanking maneuvers of Hannibal, the adaptive tactics of Georgy Zhukov, the guerrilla strategies of countless, primitive forces that had defeated superior opponents. The Academy buzzed with anticipation. Many believed they were about to witness the definitive proof of their combat protocol's superiority. Others, particularly those who had attended Nova's unofficial seminars, weren't so sure. On the morning of the simulation, Nova stood in her quarters, checking her final modifications. Her terminal displayed a message from Earth Command. "Remember, Lieutenant, you're not just representing yourself out there." She touched the screen gently. "No pressure," she murmured, but she was smiling. After all, humanity had spent its entire history being underestimated, overlooked, and dismissed as primitive. And time after time, they had proved that sometimes the most primitive solution was exactly what was needed. Nova squared her shoulders and headed for the simulation chamber. It was time to show the galaxy's most advanced civilizations that perfection wasn't everything. Sometimes you needed a little human chaos to win the day. Evolution of combat. The grand simulation chamber of the Galactic Defense Academy had never been so crowded. Representatives from every member species packed the observation rings, their varied forms creating a living tapestry of advanced life. Nova stood at her control station, facing the massive holographic arena where her modified combat protocols would face the most sophisticated military AI in known space. "Final systems check complete," announced the Academy AI, its voice resonating through the chamber. "Standard combat protocols are online. Human-modified protocols are online. Simulation will commence in 30 seconds. Admiral Ixel's crystalline form approached Nova's station. "Lieutenant Reed, there is no shame in withdrawing. Your theories have been interesting, but perhaps it would be better to continue development before such a public demonstration." Nova's fingers danced across her control panel, making final adjustments. "Thank you for your concern, Admiral, but humanity has a long history of being told to wait. Sometimes you have to prove yourself the hard way." The simulation began with standard fleet deployments. The AI's forces moved with perfect precision, each ship positioning itself according to optimal tactical algorithms. Nova's modified forces appeared more loosely organized, maintaining what seemed to be deliberately inefficient formations. "Interesting opening gambit," muttered a quantum intelligence observer. The humans' forces are sacrificing formation integrity for what purpose? They didn't have to wait long to find out. As the AI's forces advanced in textbook patterns, Nova's fleet suddenly split into seemingly random groups. The AI responded with calculated precision, adjusting its formations to counter each group according to standard protocols. That's when Nova sprung her trap. Her scattered forces abruptly changed vectors in ways that violated standard combat doctrine. Ships that should have retreated pressed forward. Units that should have maintained formation broke apart, creating patterns that the AI struggled to predict. The perfect formations of the AI's fleet became a liability as they tried to respond to attacks coming from impossible angles. "Impossible," exclaimed a Meridian tactical expert. "Those maneuvers violate at least 7 principles of optimal combat efficiency." "They're using the AI's predictions against it," observed Harold, their energy form pulsing with excitement. "Every time it calculates an optimal response, they do something suboptimal that renders the calculation meaningless." Nova's forces pressed their advantage. She had programmed them with every unconventional tactic from human military history, feigned retreats that turned into ambushes, sacrificial moves that opened up unexpected opportunities, and strategies that seemed to defy logic but proved devastatingly effective. The AI's perfect formations began to break down as they tried to adapt to the chaos. Their responses, still bound by the rules of optimal combat, became increasingly predictable. Nova's forces, free to embrace imperfection, struck from every angle. The simulation ended with a decisive victory for Nova's modified protocols. The chamber erupted in a cacophony of alien expressions, clicks, hums, pheromone bursts, and electromagnetic pulses, all conveying various degrees of shock and amazement. High Commander Zelitha's plasma form swirled with intense patterns. "Lieutenant Reed, your demonstration has been enlightening. Perhaps we have been too quick to dismiss what we considered primitive." "Not primitive, Commander," Nova corrected gently. "Different. Humans learned warfare through necessity, not optimization. We had to adapt, to think creatively, to find ways to win even when victory seemed impossible. That's what my modifications tried to capture, not just the tactics, but the mindset." Admiral Ixel's crystalline form had taken on a new configuration that Nova had never seen before, something almost like humility. "You have given us much to consider, Lieutenant. Our perfect systems may have made us inflexible." In the days that followed, Nova's modifications were integrated into the Academy's curriculum. The term primitive tactics was replaced with adaptive warfare. Students began studying human military history alongside advanced combat algorithms, learning that sometimes the most sophisticated solution was to think simply. Nova stood at the same observation deck where her journey had begun, watching a new generation of cadets practice maneuvers that combined alien precision with human unpredictability. Her datapad buzzed with a message from Earth Command: "Well done, Lieutenant. How does it feel to revolutionize galactic military doctrine?" She smiled, remembering all the dismissive comments about primitive human warfare. In the end, it wasn't about being primitive or advanced, it was about understanding that real combat wasn't perfect, and sometimes the best warriors were the ones who could adapt when everything went wrong. VYX materialized beside her, their gaseous form showing patterns of amusement. "The Academy AI has requested an upgrade to handle the increased complexity of our new combat protocols. Apparently, perfection isn't as simple as it used to be." Nova laughed. Humanity had earned its place among the stars not by being perfect, but by being perfectly unpredictable. And in doing so, they had taught the galaxy's most advanced civilizations a lesson they would never forget: sometimes the best way forward was to embrace a little chaos. "Ready for your next class, Professor Reed?" VYX asked, using her newly appointed title. Nova nodded, gathering her materials for her lecture on adaptive warfare and creative combat solutions. The galaxy was evolving, and humanity's so-called primitive wisdom was helping to lead the way. After all, She thought as she headed to her classroom full of eager alien students, the best victories were the ones that nobody saw coming, especially when they came from the most unexpected sources.